"You are a thief, Sarah. Hand over your keys." The words didn't just hang in the air. They felt like a physical weight, pressing the oxygen out of the hallway. Sarah Jenkins stood paralyzed. Her fingers still felt the slight dampness of the lavender soap she'd used after cleaning up the mess in the cafeteria. Behind her, the heavy double doors of the Oak Ridge Academy lunchroom remained closed, hiding the truth of what had just happened. Richard Sterling, the principal, stood there like a monolith of corporate coldness. At 55, he was a man who measured his worth in the crispness of his shirt collar and the precision of his budget cuts. His eyes were flinty, gray, and entirely hollow. To him, the school wasn't a place of learning. It was a machine. And today, he had decided Sarah was a broken gear. "I didn't steal anything, Richard," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "The boy hadn't eaten in 2 days. His mother is working 3 jobs. The chicken wrap was destined for the dumpster. It was waste." "It was school property," Richard snapped. He didn't just take her lanyard. He snatched it. The plastic ID, Sarah Jenkins, 3rd grade lead, snapped back against his palm with a sharp crack. 11 years of service, and you're being escorted out like a common criminal for a $5 meal. "We have protocols for a reason, Sarah. People like you think compassion is an excuse for chaos." Behind him, the board treasurer leaned against the lockers, checking his gold watch. He didn't look up. To him, Sarah was just a line item being deleted to save on a veteran's salary. Sarah's world blurred. 11 years. She had spent her weekends grading papers by candlelight when the school's budget couldn't cover the extra hours. She had bought supplies for her students with her own rent money. She had stayed late to hold the hands of crying children whose parents were stuck in traffic. And now, she was being discarded over a piece of bread and chicken that would have been rotting in a landfill by sunset. The justice reversal was already in motion, though Sarah couldn't see it. In the shadows of the utility closet, Elias, the janitor, stood holding a mop handle. He was a man who lived in the periphery. The invisible help that people like Richard stepped over without a second glance. Elias had seen the whole thing. He had seen Sarah sneak that wrap to little Leo, whose ribs were starting to show through his tattered t-shirt. He had seen the way Leo's eyes lit up and the way Sarah had whispered, "Eat up, sweetheart. It's our secret." Elias' grip tightened on the mop. In another life, across an ocean, Elias had been a king of industry, a man whose word could move mountains. He had come to America to find peace in simplicity, to be nobody. But as he watched Richard Sterling sneer at the woman who was the only person in the building to ever ask him if his back was hurting, something old and powerful woke up inside him. Richard leaned in, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "Pack your things. The security guard will wait outside your classroom. Don't speak to the children. We don't want your influence lingering." The injustice was a cold, sharp blade. Sarah took her box of belongings, her eyes fixed on the floor. She felt the eyes of the other teachers on her, some sympathetic, some terrified. She walked out of the heavy oak doors, the Texas sun blinding her as she reached her dented Toyota. She thought it was the end of her life. She didn't know that Elias was already on his burner phone. His voice no longer the humble janitor's, but the voice of a man who owned the very air Richard Sterling breathed. "Mof, buy the school's debt, all of it. By tomorrow morning, I want to be the landlord of Oak Ridge Academy and fire the principal. I have someone much better in mind for the job." The reversal had begun. The villain had his moment of triumph, but the clock was already ticking on his downfall. Richard Sterling thought he had saved $5. He didn't realize he had just lost everything. Elias moved through the halls of Oak Ridge Academy like a ghost in gray coveralls. To the faculty, he was just the help, a background character meant to empty trash cans and scrub away the scuff marks left by 1,000 restless children. He was the man you walked past while talking on your cell phone, the man who held the door open only to never be thanked. He was invisible because he chose to be, but Elias saw everything. While Principal Richard Sterling spent his afternoons staring at spreadsheets and calculating how to squeeze more profit out of a nonprofit institution, Elias was in the trenches. From behind his mop bucket, Elias saw which teachers actually taught and which ones just checked their watches. He saw which children came to school with bruises and which ones came with empty stomachs. He saw the secrets people thought were safe because they assumed a janitor wasn't important enough to listen. Nobody ever wondered how a man with hands as calloused as oak and eyes as deep as an ancient well ended up pushing a broom in a mid-sized American town. They didn't see the way he analyzed the school's structural flaws or the way he could fix a complex electrical surge with a casual twist of a screwdriver. They didn't see the man who, only 3 years ago, sat in a boardroom in Lagos, Nigeria, deciding the fate of multi-billion-dollar infrastructure projects. Elias Adeyemi had been a titan. He had built bridges that connected nations and skyscrapers that pierced the clouds. But when he lost his wife to a tragedy that money couldn't fix, the gold in the glass felt like a cage. He had retired into the ultimate disguise, poverty. He wanted to see the world for what it really was when the cameras weren't flashing. He wanted to know who the good people were when they had nothing to gain from him. For 2 years at Oak Ridge, Sarah Jenkins was the only person who passed the test. She was the only one who noticed when he had a cold. She was the only one who shared her homemade sandwiches with him during the late-night shifts. And most importantly, she was the only one who treated the invisible man like he had a soul. The mystery of Elias is what held the air in the room. He was the silent observer, the hidden judge in a world of vanity. When Richard Sterling cornered Sarah in that hallway and stripped her of her dignity, he did it right in front of Elias. Richard didn't even lower his voice. Why would he? To Richard, a janitor was just another piece of furniture. He didn't realize he was committing a crime in front of the one man who could buy and sell his entire life 10 times over. The tension of the invisible billionaire trope is the ticking clock. The audience knows that Elias is a lion in a sheep's skin, and they are waiting, breathless, for the moment he decides to roar. As Sarah walked away in tears, Elias didn't shout. He didn't interfere. He waited until the hallway was empty, the silence only broken by the hum of the vending machine. He reached into the hidden compartment of his cleaning cart and pulled out a sleek, black satellite phone, a device that cost more than Richard's car. He didn't look like a janitor anymore. His back straightened, his gaze sharpened into a blade of pure authority. The invisible man was stepping into the light. "It's Elias," he said into the phone, his voice dropping an octave into a tone of absolute command. "The social experiment is over. Activate the acquisition. I want the deed to the academy, the contracts of the board, and the employment records for everyone on the 7th floor. By dawn, I want to be the only person Richard Sterling has to answer to." He hung up and looked at the mop. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't pick it up. He left it leaning against the wall, a relic of a life he no longer needed to lead. The mystery was over. The judgment had been passed, and the man they ignored was about to become the only man they feared. Vivid sensory details for immersion. Asterisk. Instead of just saying she was sad, the script uses specific imagery: the smell of lavender soap, the oily voice of the treasurer, the Clint-like eyes. For a USA audience, these descriptive details Make the story feel like a professional movie rather than a narrated article. The air in the hallway didn't just feel cold. It felt clinical, smelling of industrial bleach and the metallic tang of old lockers. Sarah Jenkins stood perfectly still, but her world was a blur of sharp, jagged sensations. She could still feel the lingering warmth of the lavender soap on her palms, a soft, floral scent that felt tragically out of place in a moment that tasted like copper and salt. Richard Sterling didn't just speak. His voice arrived like a sliding blade. It was a sound stripped of all humidity, dry and brittle as dead leaves. "Hand over the keys, Sarah," he said. As he moved closer, the faint, cloying scent of his expensive cologne, something with notes of cedar and arrogance, hit her. It was a smell that didn't belong in a school. It belonged in a high-rise office, where people were fired over lunch breaks. Sarah looked at his eyes. They weren't just mean. They were flint-like, the color of a wet sidewalk under a gray sky. There was no flicker of the decade they had worked together, no memory of the faculty Christmas parties, or the time she had covered his shifts when he was ill. His pupils were tiny pinpricks of icy resolve. Beside him, the board treasurer shifted his weight. If Richard was the blade, the treasurer was the rust. His voice was oily, sliding over the conversation with a sickening slickness that made Sarah's skin crawl. "We have to look at the optics, Ms. Jenkins," he said, and the way he pronounced optics felt like grease on a clean plate. He adjusted his silk tie, the fabric hissing against his starched white shirt, a sound as predatory as a snake in tall grass. Sarah's hands began to shake, the fine tremors vibrating the cardboard box she held. The box was heavy, the bottom damp from where she had set it on a wet counter, and the rough grain of the cardboard bit into her fingertips. Inside, the artifacts of her life rattled. The world's greatest teacher mug with the chipped handle, the stapler she dropped so many times the spring groaned, and the small succulent in a ceramic pot, its leaves a vibrant, stubborn green against the suffocating gray of the hall. Down the corridor, Elias, the janitor, was working. The rhythmic swish thud of his mop against the linoleum provided the heartbeat to her humiliation. The water in his bucket was murky, swirling with the gray silt of 1,000 footprints. But Elias himself was a pillar of stillness. Sarah caught the scent of him as she began her long walk toward the exit, a mixture of old tobacco, sawdust, and the honest, earthy smell of a man who worked with his back. As she pushed open the heavy oak exit doors, the sound was a groan of protest. The Texas heat hit her like a physical blow, thick and humid, smelling of scorched asphalt and the coming rain. The transition from the air-conditioned tomb of the school to the vibrating life of the afternoon was jarring. Her old Toyota sat in the parking lot, the sun glinting off the cracked windshield, creating a spiderweb of light that hurt her eyes. She sat in the driver's seat, the vinyl upholstery hot enough to sting through her slacks. She didn't just cry, she broke. The tears weren't quiet. They were hot and thick, tasting of the salt of 11 years of unappreciated labor. The steering wheel felt sticky under her grip, and the hum of the engine was a low, mournful growl. Every sense was dialed to 10, recording the exact texture of her heartbreak. A movie playing in high definition, where even the smallest detail screamed that her life would never be the same. The fluorescent lights of the administrative wing flickered with a rhythmic, buzzing hum, sounding like a countdown. On Richard Sterling's desk sat a single laminated sheet of paper titled Code of Conduct, Section 4. Misuse of resources to Richard. That paper was the law of the land, a holy text that kept the chaos of the world at bay. To Sarah, it was a death warrant for common sense. The contrast sat on the desk between them. A crumpled receipt for a $5 chicken wrap and Sarah's 11-year service pin. "The protocol is clear, Sarah," Richard said, his voice flat and devoid of the tremors of human emotion. "The food in the cafeteria is inventory. Taking it without a transaction is theft. Whether it goes into a child's stomach or the incinerator is irrelevant to the balance sheet." Sarah felt a hollow ache in her chest. She thought of Leo. She thought of the way the boy's ribs had looked like a bird cage under his thin shirt. When she had handed him that wrap, he hadn't just eaten it, he had inhaled it, his small hands shaking with a hunger that no protocol could ever justify. "He was starving, Richard," she whispered. "He hadn't eaten since the school breakfast 2 days ago. His mother's car broke down. She couldn't get to the food pantry. Are you telling me that $5 of processed poultry is worth more than a 7-year-old's dignity?" Richard didn't blink. "I am telling you that rules are the only thing that separates this institution from a soup kitchen. If I let you feed one, I have to feed 100, and if I feed 100, the budget collapses. The protocol is the protection." This was the moral chasm. On one side stood Richard's world of protection, a cold, sterile fortress built of spreadsheets, liability waivers, and bottom lines. On the other side stood Sarah's world of humanity, a messy, emotional landscape where a teacher's job didn't end at the chalkboard, and where a child's health was the only metric that mattered. The absurdity of the stakes was what made the air feel thick. 11 years. 4,000 days of showing up early. Thousands of dollars of her own money spent on crayons and notebooks. Hundreds of hours spent tutoring for free. All of that loyalty, all of that history, was being weighed against a $5 wrap that was literally destined for the trash. The math didn't make sense to anyone with a heart, but Richard wasn't using a heart. He was using a calculator. "You're choosing a wrap over a teacher," Sarah said, the realization finally hardening her voice. "You're throwing away a decade of excellence for a rounded-down decimal point." "I'm choosing the integrity of the system," Richard replied. Watching from the doorway, leaning on a mop that had seen more honesty than that office ever would, Elias felt the weight of the moment. He saw the protocol for what it really was, a shield for cowards who were afraid to lead with their souls. He saw Richard's system as a cage that trapped the light out of people like Sarah. The stakes were set. The audience, the invisible witnesses in the hallway, could feel the boiling point rising. It was no longer about a job or a lunch. It was a war between a machine and a human. As Sarah was escorted out, the injustice felt like a physical pressure in the room, a wound that only the most extreme payback could heal. Richard thought he had won a victory for his protocols. He didn't realize that by choosing the $5 wrap, he had signed away a fortune he couldn't even imagine. He had chosen the rule, and now, the man who owned the rules was about to tear them up in his face. The transformations began not with a bang, but with the silence of a discarded mop. For 2 years, that mop had been Elias Adeyemi's only companion, a wooden staff that marked him as the lowest rung on the social ladder of Oak Ridge Academy. But as the sun climbed over the private hangar at Teterboro Airport the following morning, the gray coveralls were gone. In their place was a charcoal gray suit crafted from wool so fine it seemed to absorb the morning light. Sarah Jenkins stepped out of the black Maybach, her breath catching in the back of her throat. The tarmac was a vast, shimmering mirror of heat and asphalt, and at its center sat a Gulfstream G700. It was a masterpiece of aerospace engineering, pure white, with a singular gold stripe that ran like a lightning bolt down its fuselage. This wasn't just a plane. It was a sovereign territory on wings. And there, standing at the foot of the air stair, was the man she had known only as Elias. The contrast was staggering. Gone was the slight hunch of a man trying to be smaller than the room. Elias stood with his shoulders squared, his chin level, radiating a quiet, terrifying authority. The silver at his temples no longer looked like the mark of a tired worker. It looked like the crown of a king. The invisible janitor had vanished, replaced by a titan who moved with the grace of someone who owned the horizon. "Elias?" Sarah whispered, her voice lost in the whine of distant jet engines. "The broom was a choice, Sarah," Elias said, his voice now a deep, resonant baritone that commanded the air around them. "I wanted to see who people were when they thought I was nobody. I saw Richard Sterling, and I saw you." Behind him stood a phalanx of assistants and lawyers, their tablets glowing with the digital blueprints of a hostile takeover. Among them, looking pale and nauseous, was the school board treasurer. He was the same man who, 24 hours earlier, had looked at Sarah like she was an insect. Now, he wouldn't even meet her eyes. He stood clutching a leather briefcase, his hands trembling. "Mr. Adeyemi," the treasurer stammered, "the transfer of the school's primary debt is complete. You are now the majority stakeholder of the academy's land and assets." Elias didn't even look at him. His focus remained on Sarah. "Yesterday, they told you that $5 was worth more than your loyalty. Today, I am telling them that their entire system is worth less than the coffee you used to share with me." The payoff hit like a physical wave. The audience watching this story doesn't just see a man getting rich. They see the ultimate cosmic correction. The man who was stepped on is now the giant, and the man who thought he was a giant. Richard Sterling is currently being barred from the school gates by security guards who used to take his orders. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold fountain pen. He handed Sarah a document. It wasn't just a job offer. It was a charter. "I didn't just buy a school, Sarah. I bought a platform. I want you to run it. No protocols. No spreadsheets over souls. Just education." As the jet's engines roared to life, a low, powerful vibration that shook the very ground they stood on, the transition was complete. The mop had been traded for a fleet, the gray closet for a private cabin in the sky. It was the ultimate dopamine hit, the moment where the world finally made sense again, where the good were elevated to the clouds, and the cruel were left staring at the empty parking spot where their power used to live. Sarah looked at the jet, then at Elias, and for the first time in 11 years, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged.